Welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is delighted to have with us author Nicole M Miller, whose new book is Until Our Time Comes. The book will soon be available in bookstores and libraries near you. The Poison Pen does have copies on order, and we would be happy to hold one or put one in the mail for you. Just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen Bookstore. Now I'd like to welcome Nicole M Miller.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here and excited to chat.
Thank you for joining us. My first question for you, as with many other authors, is you had a life before you wrote Until Our Time Comes. Who was Nicole during that time period?
Oh, well, this book has actually been written and rewritten over the course of about 23 years. So I technically started it back when I was like 14 or 15 years old. And I was the same girl then that I think I am now, which is horse obsessed and history obsessed. And so everything kind of comes together in this one manuscript. And the story was one that really set me on my writing journey in a lot of ways. But I've always been just a voracious reader and loved history. And I have horses. I have two Arabian horses. And so I've always been really fascinated by the history of the breed itself. And that led me to discover a few of these fun facts that turned into this broader story that takes place in World War II. So yeah, and I think, until this was published, I've just done everything from nonfiction writing and journalism to now I'm an HR professional for a couple different I've done HR for a couple different tech companies, and so I have a lot of different interests, but I still have the horses and I'm still, again, totally obsessed with them day to day.
When you decided to sit down and write Until Our Time Comes, as you mentioned, the book was inspired by something. You had read another book.
Yes, so I had been reading a biography of a stallion that had been rescued during World War II. It had been seized by the Nazis and then later rescued. And there were just a few really small details that really captured me. The way that the staff really tried to save this horse from being captured. They tried to disguise him and make him look ugly instead of this beautiful horse that, was recognized as a well-bred horse. And so that to me was a really fascinating story, and like what drives these people to save a horse in the midst of a German, of enemy invasion during a war. And just the lengths they went to was a really fascinating thing for me to explore, and ended up just writing more about it.
What can you tell us about Until Our Time Comes?
Yes, so it's the story of an American horse trainer who is in Poland when war breaks out, and a British spy comes to her aid, and there's a love story that develops between the two of them over the course of both trying to save the horses from capture, both being in Poland during the occupation, and then later on, as the war advances, what it looks like at the end of the war and how they try to escape just the collateral damage that happens at the end of World War II. So lots of daring adventures, and of course a lot of romance.
I always love learning new things when I read fiction because fiction is based on fact in many cases. What can you tell us about, I'm probably going to pronounce it incorrectly, but the Janów Podlaski farm?
Yeah, yeah. So, and I'm not great at pronouncing these either, but I think it's Janów Podlaski. And it is a farm in eastern Poland. It still is a running breeding, or operational breeding farm today. And it has a 1,000-year history of being some of the or providing some of the most beautiful horses in Poland. And Poland is very proud of their Polish Arabian bloodlines and continues to do so. It's a very big breeder, and there's big shows there every year, and it's just I follow it on social media because I just love the photos that come out of this beautiful farm of these gorgeous horses, and it's certainly on my bucket list to go there one day. But this farm was has been around since the 1800s, I believe, and had experienced a lot of turmoil. Poland, of course, has been invaded many, many times. And so the farm itself has been nearly decimated multiple times over. In World War I, about 90% of the horses were all killed. And so there was a very small amount of horses that rebuilt over the period between World War I and then World War II. So I think it's a part and a testament to the resilience of the farm and the staff and their commitment to this bloodline and these horses. And it's a deep part of Poland's culture, these horses, and even people who maybe aren't familiar with like animals or who aren't as obsessed with horses as I am. I've talked to a couple folks who live in Poland who do know of those horses and how important the horses are. And so it's, it's more culture and art and history than just an animal.
One of the other things I found fascinating was, and you can perhaps elaborate on this, but there really was a German super horse program they were trying to develop.
Yeah, yeah, they did this with a lot of animals. And it didn't seem like it necessarily would be a big focus in such a mechanized war, but it was a huge focus, and they collected horses from all over Europe, and some of the best horses ever were brought to this farm, and they started, mixing bloodlines and trying to selectively choose certain traits and things like that. And a lot of true horsemen weren't necessarily thrilled by this because there's, a lot of reason that individual bloodlines are good at certain things. Thoroughbreds are better for long distance running and racing, and Arabians have a bunch of different features that are very like selective for other things. The Lipizzaner horses of Austria were also taken to that farm as well, and those are those beautiful white dancing horses, and they have a very long and deep cultural history as well. So it was a bit of a, oddity in so many ways as a lot of things in World War II were, but it was a established program and they were really serious about it, and they did work to protect the horses from, the bombings and the things that happened near the end of the war as the Allies were encroaching more and more into Axis territory. So yeah, really fascinating and interesting thing.
It is, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised since the Nazi Germans seemed obsessed about breeding and all that. They were doing it with babies and things like that in hospitals and stuff that they had. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but not necessarily pleasant to learn
No,
about.
not at all. Yeah.
Um, I also didn't really, perhaps I had known, but I didn't really absorb it. But Poland didn't just face danger from Germany and the Nazis. It was also the Soviets that really were a threat.
Yeah, yeah. Very early in the war, there was a non-aggression pact, but the Russians also were very interested in getting parts of Poland, Eastern Poland back that had once been Russian territory. I mean, I think the landscape of Europe has changed so many times throughout the generations that there's a lot of that deep, history and culture and certain areas of Eastern Poland where maybe even Russian, like speaking and all of that. So it was very complicated, and the Russians did come in right as the Germans were invading, and they seized a lot of land in Eastern Poland, and then Germany and Russia kind of worked things out and had a different like dividing line. And then, Russia, of course, ended up switching allegiance a little bit throughout the war. But yeah, really interesting that Poland has been sandwiched between the two for many, I mean, forever. And so it's been a really tough place for them to be. And I think that that's been part of their history as well.
When you're writing historical fiction, like Until Our Time Comes, you kind of have to do a balancing act between how much history to include without it coming across as a textbook and
Mhm.
how much you bring in as the creator, as the author. Can you talk a little bit about writing that, where you find the balance, and what sources, historical sources, you found particularly useful?
Yeah, definitely. I tried to use a lot of like first person sources as much as possible. There's a lot of documentation around Janów Podlaski and the history there of the horses. And so the farm itself has a lot of that deep history written down and put on their website and things like that. There's lots of books written about it as well. When it comes to some of the later parts of the book, where some of the US soldiers are coming in, there were a lot of great reports that the soldiers had and websites of these direct, word for word, reports from the soldiers. And it's always interesting when all of that, when certain things conflict, or like the distances or the town names or all these things conflict. And so there's probably areas where I just kind of picked one and or kind of found an average between two distances, because one person said 17 kilometers, one person said 21, and some of it is best guess in that respect. It's also interesting with looking at maps from like 1939 or 1941 versus current day maps, and trying to figure out locations between towns, because the town boundaries maybe have changed or the name of the town has changed. And so there's a little bit of sleuthing that has to happen there. And so again, some of it is a little bit of best guess and, kind of going with the heart of the story. But yeah, I tried to go with as many like first person or direct sources as I could. And there's been a couple books specifically that cover some of these true events that have come out very recently. Like Elizabeth Letts wrote a book called The Perfect Horse, and it covers a lot of this. And so I would look at her bibliography and go to some of those direct sources as well, because her story was super, super well researched. And so again, looking at those direct references were really helpful too.
And you do include a mix of real historical people in your book and your own creations. Like Patent is a real person, obviously, but I couldn't figure out whether Werner Vogel, you created him, didn't you?
Did create him. He is loosely based off of the soldier, the German soldier who was in charge of Janów Podlaski. And he was a true horseman who cared far more about the horses than any Nazi agenda. And he did collaborate with the Americans at the end of the war to protect the horses. And he knew he was going to be essentially labeled a traitor for it, but he cared about the horses and not the German pride of whatever it looked like to surrender the horses to the Allies. And so he's heavily modeled after a real person. And there were a lot of other German soldiers who did help make sure that those horses were protected and not lost at the end of the war.
What did you discover about this time period that surprised you the most while you were researching it?
Oh, I think one of my favorite things was just how popular the horses were at the time. They were, again, they were part of like culture in a way that maybe we don't have now. You wouldn't maybe recognize a horse by looking at him in our current era. But they knew back in the 30s that this stallion, who was very recognizable and very, very well bred, would be known to the Germans and thus desirable to the Germans, as they were trying to keep this horse out of their hands. And the Germans from a different country, different region, all of that were able to recognize him and knew him by name. And that was a really fascinating thing to me, of just kind of, you know, horses being celebrities back in the day versus now it's maybe a Triple Crown winner. You'll get a name recognition, but I don't know that people would recognize the horse per se.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is a little bit different. We do kind of watch the Kentucky Derby, but not with that same fervor like in the 1930s when was it Secretariat or whatever the horse
Yeah,
was?
Secretariat. Yep.
It was like everyone was fascinated by him.
Yeah, totally.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing process? Because this was your first novel. You'd written other short stories and nonfiction and things like that. What was it like actually sitting down to write the book? Did you know in advance? You had everything plotted out? Did you just kind of hope it would come together as you wrote it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to outline my books. I'm not as good at the just sitting down and writing and letting it flow. I like to have a sort of map of where I want the story to end up. And this one had a bit of a predetermined structure because there were certain historical elements that I knew I wanted to include. And that evolved over the years too, because this started out when I wrote it back when I was 14 or 15. This started out as a 3-book trilogy that followed, the story throughout many, many years. And over the course of writing it, rewriting it, and pitching it and getting feedback from publishers and all of that, it evolved quite a bit. And then eventually is a standalone novel that covers, all 6 years, 7 years of the war, from that perspective. So it's changed a lot. And I am really grateful. I have a wonderful critique group that I meet with locally once a month, and they were really pivotal in helping shape and hone and really fine tune this manuscript to what it is today. And of course, I also had amazing editors with my publisher as well to help craft it. So yeah, this one has just been everything from writing notes and notebooks to typing away at it every year, to some extent. It's been just an ongoing, I think, odyssey.
Did your background in journalism help you in the writing process?
Oh, I think so, especially from a research perspective and just kind of tracking all of that information. So I'm very much a note taker, documenting everything. I've got copies of everything. I've got things printed out and just stored everywhere about this story. So I think that helped a lot. And it's the journalism skills I've learned have helped with other manuscripts as well, where I'm going and pulling up newspaper articles to get more of a flavor of the period or whatever that is. And also interviewing people directly, other manuscripts. I've talked with folks that have been maybe more some experience something that is in the manuscript itself. So I think all of that tends to apply and overlap.
What do you know now, having your first book published, as a writer, that you would want to go back in time and tell yourself when you were starting out? What advice would you give yourself?
I think the one thing that I wasn't expecting early on in my writing career was that I would write a bunch of different manuscripts and that some of them would go nowhere. Most of them have gone nowhere except for this one. But I kept coming back to this one individual one, because it was just so deeply rooted in what I'm passionate about, and the story just kind of wouldn't let me go. And so I think like knowing that it was good and okay that I wrote other things in the meantime, I think it made me a stronger writer. It gave me other feedback from publishers about different things they were looking for, which helped me then, reframe the story a little bit more. So I think knowing and embracing that is helpful, because then you're not like maybe so fixated on just one manuscript and then losing sight of the other things you could be working on, or the other skills or the other manuscripts that could be a better first book for you, or whatever that is. So I think that's been something I'm really seeing now. And the timing of this one was very special, because again, it was very much one that I started with, and I didn't know if it would ever actually come out or if it would really resonate with audiences or publishers, and such a small piece of history and Eastern Poland, which is very little known, and all of that. So I wasn't sure it would quite land or resonate, and luckily it did.
Why do you think people are so fascinated with World War II as a time period?
I think there's I think it was one of the eras where we have so many firsthand accounts, even still, that are emerging and have been shared, of all these little pieces of valor and bravery and endurance and just inspiring stories that are just timeless in some way. And so I think there's just this connection that we still have with this era, and it's modern enough in some ways that maybe we still see ourselves in it, but also it's a little bit distant, that it feels more nostalgic, or like a little more wholesome in some respect. And so I think there's this both fascination and like glamour to the time period. And I don't know, like I do think wonder about that, as far as like why isn't World War One a little bit more
Mhm.
magnetic? It wasn't that different of a period per se, but there's something about World War Two. It feels like a very perhaps very clear and obvious, like righteous war in some ways, that it was very evident, what we were fighting for and what, good and evil came out of it. And so maybe there's some clarity there that we're all just like hungry for and looking at.
Very perceptive. Yeah, I think you're right. World War One, it's hard to picture either side as being totally evil. I mean, they both kind of have their reasons, though you do kind of stick for the Allies. But World War Two really gives you much more of a clear-cut division between which side is right and which side is wrong.
Yeah.
Authors often invest a little bit of themselves in their characters, and I think you mentioned that is it Ada, your heroine,
Yeah. Yep. There we go.
shares a passion for horses. Can you talk a little bit about how that came into your own life?
Yeah, I mean, I think Adia is probably the character I would want to be. If a war broke out and I would be uh, saving horses, that would be the person I would hope to be one day when I grow up. So I think she's a little bit of that, projection in some ways. But I've always had that just sort of narrow focused, like focused on horses all the time. And she's a little bit like that too. She has her own blinders on and is very focused on the horses, sometimes at the expense of her own health or life or the people around her. And so I think that drove me with her as a character. I also again started this when I was 14 or 15. And so like the strong horse trainer has always been just kind of the like character that's been in my mind, and has driven me from there. I always viewed myself as growing up to be a horse trainer and all of that, which, you know, I'm glad I've done lots of other things that I'm certainly happy with the way my life has turned out. But that was certainly the vision I think I had for a long time.
Let's talk a little bit about Nicole as a reader, because you write historical fiction. Has that kind of been a reading passion of yours? Do you have other kinds of things that you've read? Were there authors that kind of were important to you that made you want to become a writer yourself?
Yeah, definitely. So I have always loved historical fiction. I've also really loved contemporary fiction and contemporary romance. Certainly always aired toward inspirational fiction a little bit more. But my interests have broadened a lot as I've grown up and aged, and I very much enjoy like young adult fiction now, and like fantasy and sci-fi and things like that. So I'll tend to read a lot of different things. I'll read a lot of nonfiction as well. I love history books, and especially narrative nonfiction where there's a really strong storytelling component. Something like Unbreakable, or I'm sorry, Unbroken, by Lauren Hildebrand. So lots of different interests there. And then I will say there was so in early 2007, 2008, I was really working on networking at writers conferences and trying to find a literary agent for this manuscript in particular. And it was a little bit before World War II fiction became a thing. And so I hadn't seen much. I kept hearing that no one's interested in World War II fiction. Publishers only wanted Amish fiction at the time. It was, just that was just what I kept hearing again and again. But there, around that time was also when Sarah Sundin broke out with her World War II fiction. And she really did pave the way for especially inspirational historical fiction as a genre. And so I'd been following her and reading her voraciously, and she's been a huge supporter of mine throughout the years. And I'm really, really grateful for her in particular. So yeah, it's been really fun to follow her journey.
That's fascinating. Um, Perhaps you can also clarify or elaborate or perhaps dispel. There's a misperception, I think, on the part of many people who don't read inspirational fiction that it's monolithic, that every single inspirational book is exactly the same, but it really is different as the authors who write them.
Yes, it's so true. And I'll mention too, like I have a very like light thread of faith throughout the book, but it's not a huge emphasis on the story. It's more of the underlying component. I think for me, it's more about knowing that it's going to be, language free and sex scene free. And that just for me is just a level of expectation that I hope to go into a book with.
Um, You can say as much or as little as you like about the next question, but what's next for you as an author?
Yeah, so we're excited to see how this one resonates and really, what it looks like upon release and if readers like it. Horse fiction, horse historical fiction is a bit of a narrow genre there, so
Um,
I'm hoping there's enough of us like horse nerds and history nerds that we're, excited to read it and wanting more. And so I have a lot of other historical ideas, different time periods, different eras. There's a ton of amazing stories where there's like a certain horse that is really inspiring, that has been impactful. There's been different, breeds that have been really timeless and important to certain cultures and things like that as well. And so I have a lot of different ideas that I want to explore. And we'll kind of go from there, depending on if folks like this one.
so it sounds like in some ways you want to be the adult version of Marguerite O'Henry.
I would love that. That would be that would be amazing.
Um, this next question you may not know, but I just have to ask, are you aware of the old Disney film, The Miracle of the White Stallions?
Yes, I am. I have the DVD somewhere in my bookshelf behind me. So, yeah, I'm excited. I love that story and that component to it. And it's another book idea I have as well to dive more into that one. But yes, I am familiar with that movie.
How can readers find out more about you and your books? Are you on social media?
Yes, my website is NicoleMillerWriter.com, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Nicole Miller Writer as well. So those are the best places to follow me. And I do have a newsletter as well if you want to sign up on the website.
It's great. I can't believe how quickly our minutes have flown by. We've been very fortunate to have with us Nicole Miller, whose new book is Until Our Time Comes. Will be out soon at bookstores or libraries near you. I'd like to thank Nicole for taking time to share with us about her book and herself. And
Thank
thank
you
you for
so much.
joining in another episode of Author Chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.